It began in Africa. It began when the first slaves were brought to America. It began with the proclamation, with the Civil War, and the Reconstruction, with all those broken promises.
But for the public person that we remember today, for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the world he changed, you could say it began with Rosa Parks.
December 1st, 1955, Montgomery, Alabama. Bus number 2857. Rosa Parks, 42 years old, sits in the front row of the black-only bus seats. A bus driver named Jimmy Blake so a white man could sit down.
You remember that Lauren said that the seats had signs and you could flip them one way or the other. When Rosa sat down, she was sitting in a black section. Some white folks got on the bus, and Jimmy decided they shouldn't be standing. So he went where Rosa was and flipped the sign. 3 people got up and moved. Rosa didn't. It wasn't that she selected a place to sit in the white section. She was sitting where she was supposed to. Jimmy came along and said, "Move." 3 people got up and moved. Rosa moved to the side. She did not move. She wasn't tired, like people say. And she said back in there that she was just tired of giving in.
While she waited, Jimmy Blake went to call the police. She got arrested and was hauled away.
Miss Parks wasn't the first to protest bus segregation. Irene Morgan had done the same thing 9 years before, and Sarah Keyes had done it just a few months earlier. The U.S. Supreme Court had already said she didn't have to move. She had rights.
But this time somebody noticed. In fact, everybody noticed. That's how the Birmingham bus boycott began and how Martin Luther King Jr. found her.
There's no denying it. Rosa Parks was making a point, and she knew it. She was the secretary of the Montgomery chapter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. And when she said no to Jimmy Blake, she was already a worker in civil rights and racial equality. And in 1945, Jimmy Blake had told her to get off the bus. She tried to get on the front of the bus, and he said, "No, you have to get on the bus because that's where black folks get on." Well, she got off to go on, and he drove away. She had tried to avoid being on the bus that he was driving. She missed it this time. So she knew what she was doing, but she was just tired of it. She lost her job as a seamstress at a local department store, but she started the movement.
E.D. Nixon, president of the local NAACP, wanted for an act of injustice that would galvanize the black community and drive them to action.
After Rosa Parks was arrested, E.D. Nixon organized a meeting of local ministers at the home church of a young minister, Martin Luther King Jr. A little later on, King was elected to lead the boycott, mainly because he was new in town and unknown, and the city fathers of Montgomery hadn't had a chance to intimidate him. E.D. Nixon had actually had to push Reverend King to get him to take the job, but he did it, finally, and the world started to change.
The night of Rosa Parks' arrest, Joanne Robinson, head of the Women's Political Council, printed and circulated a flyer throughout Montgomery's black community, which stated,
Another woman has been arrested and thrown in jail because she refused to get up out of her seat on the bus for a white person to sit down. This has to be stopped. The next time it may be you, your daughter, or your mother. This woman's case will come up on Monday. We are therefore asking every Negro to stay off the buses Monday in protest of the arrest and trial. Don't ride the buses to work, to town, to school, or anywhere on Monday. You can afford to stay out of school for a day if you have no other way to go except the bus. You can afford to stay out of town for one day. If you work, take a cab or walk. But please, children and grown-ups, don't ride the bus at all on Monday.
That was December 2nd. On December 3rd, almost no black people rode the buses in Montgomery, Alabama. Instead, boycotters just stayed home or organized carpools. Some white housewives even drove their black domestic servants to work. Whether they were sympathetic to the cause or just wanted to not have their servants miss a day of work.
Dr. King said it best himself. A miracle has taken place.
The city didn't like that. They pressured local insurance companies to stop insuring cars used in carpools, so the boycott leaders arranged policies with Lloyd's of London.
Black taxi drivers helped too. They changed their black fares only 10 cents for ride, the same price for a bus ride. And when the city officials heard about that, they passed a law saying it was illegal to charge a rider less than 45 cents. That didn't stop it. It just got bigger.
People started riding bicycles. They started walking. They even rode mules and horse-drawn buggies. And across the country, black churches raised money to support the boycott. They even collected shoes to replace the worn-out footwear of Montgomery's black citizens.
The white racist power structure, part of a group called the White Citizens Council, fought back. Martin Luther King Jr.'s and Ralph Abernathy's house were firebombed. So were 4 black Baptist churches. Boycotters were attacked and beaten all over town. Finally, the city of Montgomery hauled out a law passed way back in 1921 and started arresting protesters for hindering a bus. And one of those arrests was King. He ended up spending 2 weeks in prison and became a national celebrity. Much later, Dr. King said,
I was proud of my crime. It was the crime of joining my people in a nonviolent protest against injustice.
the Montgomery bus boycott was an 11-month mass protest that ended with the U.S. Supreme Court ruling that public bus segregation is unconstitutional. Dr. King saw it was much more, and that it was much more than that. It wasn't just about a black woman in Montgomery getting pushed around. It wasn't just about one law in one city. It was about the rights of all black people. It was time to stand up. King said, in all of our actions, we must stick together. Unity is the great need of the hour. And if we are united, we can get many of the things that we not only desire, but which we justly deserve.
By the way, Rosa Parks came out okay. She was awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, and there's a statue of her in the National Statuary Hall. When she died, she lay in honor of the Capitol Rotunda in Washington, D.C., only the 3rd private citizen to lie in honor in the Rotunda, Rosa Parks.
By 1963, the civil rights movement had grown into a national movement. There had been sit-ins at lunch counters, voter registration drives, and freedom rides on the interstate buses. And many school districts had accepted school desegregation. But there was fierce resistance in a number of states, including Alabama. Governor George Wallace and the officials in a number of locales vowed to resist, even in the face of court decisions and growing federal pressure. Wallace had just become governor of Alabama. His inaugural speech contained these words.
In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny. And I say, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever.
Wallace would be proven wrong, but it took several years of determined effort to overcome Alabama's white supremacist power structure.
Birmingham, Alabama, 1963. Martin Luther King Jr.'s and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference's, that's SCLC, nonviolent approach to social change was truly taking hold, and its leadership agreed. It was time to attack and head on, and to do it in the center of the segregationist resistance. Like now, Congressman John Lewis said,
Our goal in Birmingham was larger than ending segregation in one southern city. It was our hope that our efforts in Birmingham would dramatize the fight and determination of Afro-American citizens in all the southern states, and that we would force the Kennedy administration to draft and push through Congress a comprehensive Civil Rights Act outlawing segregation and racial discrimination in public accommodations, employment, and education.
Bull Connor, Birmingham's Commissioner of Public Safety, was a determined segregationist. So when SCLC finally launched its anti-segregation campaign in April, Bull Connor put up a wall of resistance.
It started with a mass meeting and direct action. King talked endlessly about the philosophy of nonviolence and its methods, and gathered volunteers for lunch counter sit-ins, marches on city halls, and a boycott of downtown merchants. The number of volunteers increased every day. Now there were kneel-ins at churches, sit-ins at the library, and a march on the county building to mark the opening of a voter registration drive.
on April 10th, the city government got a court injunction ordering an end to all protests. But Martin Luther King Jr. and the SCLC disobeyed the court order, and King declared,
We cannot, in all good conscience, obey such an injunction, which is an unjust, undemocratic, and unconstitutional misuse of the legal process.
King himself knew he would be arrested if he kept on going, and he worried about that. They were running out of money, and Dr. King was good at fundraising. He wondered if he could do more on the outside than on the inside. But finally, he decided he had to go to jail in Birmingham. Friends, he said,
I have to do a faith act. I don't know what will happen or what the outcome will be. I don't know where the money will come from.
But on April 12th, he got himself arrested for violating the court order, and he was slammed into solitary confinement.
He wasn't even allowed to call his wife, Coretta, who was home recovering from giving birth. Attorney General Bobby Kennedy and President John F. Kennedy had to put pressure on the judges personally just so Dr. King could call home.
Finally, after a huge movement all across the country just to raise money, King was released on April 19, 1963.
during his time in jail, Dr. King came to recognize how big the movement was becoming. It wasn't just about the Deep South anymore. Even though that's where the oppression of Black people was the worst and had lasted the longest. No, this was about Black people all across the country. In his famous letter from Birmingham jail, he wrote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Never again can we afford to live with the narrow, provincial, outside agitator idea. Anyone who lives inside the United States can never be considered an outsider anywhere within its bounds."
But change didn't happen just because he was released from jail. There had to be a way to keep the pressure up, to make the civil rights movement a truly national event.
And that's when the children came. The grown-ups in the movement wanted to keep up the pressure. They really wanted things to change. So they asked high school students to get involved in the demonstrations.
They had no idea what lion they were releasing.
On May 2nd, barely 2 weeks after King's release, more than 1,000 black children came together to protest in Birmingham, Alabama. 900 of them were arrested. The next day, nearly 2,500 more took their place.
And Bull Connor, still in control, couldn't stand it. He'd kept his people under control until then, much as he hated it. But now,
He ordered firefighters to turn their hoses on the protesters.
He told police officers to let their dogs loose and chase those children down.
in pictures that were broadcast and printed all over the country, nonviolent protesters were seen being beaten by angry police officers. Children were driven to the ground.
John Lewis said, "We didn't fully comprehend at first what was happening. We were witnessing police violence and brutality in Birmingham style. Unfortunately for Bull Connor, so was the rest of the world."
Agreements started to be made. Pledges for the desegregation of public accommodations, for more fair hiring practices, and for better communication between black and white leaders.
But the white racists couldn't stand that. The home of Dr. King's brother was bombed. Another bomb was planted near the motel where King was staying. A bomb went off on Sunday at 9:45 a.m. at the 16th Street Baptist Church and killed 4 little girls.
It killed 4 little girls at a Sunday school. It was a national issue now. It was time for everyone, young and old, rich and poor, to join in solidarity together.
On August 28, 1963, more than 200,000 demonstrators showed up in Washington, D.C., and marched to the Lincoln Memorial. That's where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave the speech that everyone remembers. The speech about his dream that became everyone's dream. Martin Luther King Jr. did not ask to be a leader of the civil rights movement. The Montgomery NAACP was looking for a spokesperson, and Martin Luther King Jr. was asked to speak on their behalf. The bus boycott made national news, and the young minister became a national figure. He had read about Gandhi in college and had training in nonviolent resistance, but led a mass movement based on those principles? Well, that was a new thing.
Over the course of the 11 years after Montgomery, Martin Luther King Jr. became a world figure. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. He was also expanding his vision, how to achieve real equality and real freedom for African Americans. He began to see that this would go beyond civil rights, that is, equal legal rights.
He began to see that the problem was an unequal distribution of wealth, that white, Asian, Latino, Native American, and African Americans were all suffering together in a system that perpetrated inequality and poverty. In the last days of his life, he became critical of corporate power structure and of the U.S. foreign policy.
He began to see the struggles in Africa and Latin America and in Vietnam against colonialism as a part of the same struggle that he was engaged in. He made plans to join the civil rights movement with the labor movement in what he described as a poor people's movement. He died in Memphis, Tennessee. He was there to support the sanitation workers' strike, a strike of white workers and African American workers who had united in the Deep South for their rights to organize and get decent wages.
The concrete results of the movement changed the world. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. They led directly to the enfranchisement of African Americans and directly to the inauguration day the country celebrated when our first African American president took office.
But in the final days of his life, Dr. King saw his mission widen even more. As the war in Vietnam grew deeper and wider, as thousands and thousands of black people and white people and Asian people on both sides of the war continued to die, he saw that the quest for civil rights was a quest for human rights, that it was about the oppression of all people of every race all around the world.
Today, we honor Martin Luther King Jr. We give thanks for the movement that changed the world for the better and continues to change it today. And we remind ourselves that whatever color we are, wherever we come from, who we are, whoever we are, this is our movement too. We are all part of the plan. We are all citizens of the world.
At the beginning of our service today, I wished you discomfort, unrest, and holy agitation. How will we move forward today in the continuing struggle to recognize the racism, culture of white supremacy in which all of our institutions and all Americans are steeped?
Our closing words today are by Kimberly Quinn Johnson. We are the ones that we have been waiting for. We are not perfect, but we are perfectly fitted for this day. We are not without fault, but we can be honest to face our past as we chart a new future. We are the ones that we have been waiting for. May we be bold and courageous to chart that new future. May we have faith in a future that is not known. We are the ones that we have been waiting for. We leave this gathered community, but we don't leave our connection, our concerns, or our care for each other. Our service to each other, to the world, and to our faith. It always continues. Go in peace, walk in beauty, fight for justice. Blessed be.